you have to have that particular dimension of brain that deals with esotericism. Because it's not only esoteric, but like so much of science, it is terribly, terribly empirical. It does not rely upon working from first principles, as one with visual science did. And of course, science is very, very primitive. For those of you who have not put your foot into professional science, I have to tell you that it is disgustingly primitive. Those of you who have high expectations of science, forget them, because it is nearly all totally based upon observing nature and copycatting nature. And very little is based upon pure, straightforward, deductive reasoning from first principles. And even quite simple things like dividing the circumference of a circle by its diameter doesn't give you a simple answer. You can get presented with this strange number called pi, 3.14159 something or other, which goes on forever and is not a precise number at all, because you can never reach the ultimate decimal place. And you see that the growth rate in nature, based upon the number e, is equally of this transcendental nature, that if it goes on 2.7129364 or something, it goes on forever. So two of the very basic things in nature that you might have thought would give rise to simple numbers give rise to the most complex and mysterious numbers that we know. And you get a tinge of that in looking at the golden ratio that we looked at earlier in the week. So much for Geoffrey and science. When it comes to esoteric science, of course, Geoffrey and I were again on common ground, and I learned almost everything that I know about esoteric science from Geoffrey, and all sorts of things in between. But what is so poignant about this memorial lecture is that very unusually he rang me up and said, "Colin, can you come and see me on Friday night?" Now, I've actually made arrangement to spend Friday night with my daughter. So, suspecting nothing, I said to him, "Well, would Saturday do?" And he said, "Oh yes, I think it can wait till Saturday." Mind you, I have no idea how close to the cliff edge I was. So I went and saw him on Saturday instead. And he was very disturbed. He was on a theme that preoccupied him a lot towards the end of his life, that no one had really understood, because he had gone so deeply into the mystery that he could see that he hadn't managed to bring anybody else really with him into the depth of the mystery. And so he was concerned, deeply concerned. Colin, he said, they don't understand. They don't understand. And I tried to console him. And of course, as I walked out the front door, I nearly turned and went back to him, but offered to help him up the stairs, where he had a stair lift. But I didn't. As I walked out the front door, this blast of coldness went past me, coming in. Now, I hadn't opened the front door, I'd only opened the porch door between the porch and the hallway. Suddenly I opened this interconnecting door, and this blast of coldness went past me. I thought, what was that? Because I hadn't even opened the front door. Again, I didn't think anything of it. I realised what it was. It was the angel of death had come in. And the following morning, he died at breakfast. Incredible. What a near miss. Right? If he died on a Friday night, I'd never have forgiven myself. Anyway, I am somewhat almost offended by Beethoven. Because, and I tell you why. Because this music so mirrors my feelings. Unbelievable. Right, let's look at the plan for this afternoon. Like Eddie, I like my audience to know that the ground that we're going to cover. So I've written it up on that sheet so that you can follow the progress of the talk. First of all, I want to say something about paradigms, because as in other branches of academic study, you reach a point where, I think the word gel was used this morning, where the knowledge you've accumulated suddenly comes together and gels. And if you move from being a student to being a knower, and this is true, as I say, in many branches of learning, and it's particularly true in Theosophy. Each person has to study Theosophy until they come to a point where they have their own paradigm. For some people who are brought up in a particular branch of Theosophy, they establish that paradigm in that branch and they're content with it. And no one is going to try and proselytize you and bring you into a different paradigm, because you've established one which you're content with. And when you go to lectures, you're able to colour in a bit more of the picture. You're able to increase the depth of your understanding of some part of the whole framework and cluster of knowledge that you've put together. And so there are some people who go one way, and some people go another. Some people go for what Howard called this morning neo-theosophy, some go for Blavatsky and the Master's Theosophy. And there's no quarrel about it, and you all go your own way. Just so happens, as Howard was mentioning this morning, that Geoffrey wasn't content, because I suppose he had this scientific aspect to his mind, the professional scientist's attitude, which isn't content with bodies of apparently similar teaching which don't coordinate and relate to each other precisely. And it was because of this that he spent, according to my memory of what he told me, over 2 years really in a serious intellectual agony, because he couldn't relate first and second generation Theosophy together. And when we first met and talked about all this, I said to him, well, why didn't you go down the route of considering the basis of authority? Because in Christian theology, authority is predominant. When someone puts forward a different theological perspective or statement, they say, on what authority do you make it? In fact, the Pharisees said to Jesus on one occasion, by what authority do you tell us these things? Authority is all important. And so I said to Geoffrey, I remember the discussion very, very well, that was years ago. We had this long discussion about authority, the authority of the teachings. And it was really this, I think, more than anything else, that swayed Geoffrey in the end. He had already been swayed before I met him. It wasn't me that was persuading. He was well established before I ever met him. Because he thought that the authority of the masters did not appear in the later teachings of Theosophists in the way that it appeared in Blavatsky's writings. And I think every really, really deep student of Blavatsky's Theosophy sees a different vibration almost in Blavatsky's Theosophy to that which followed afterwards. Not to say that there aren't some wonderful, wonderful glimpses of explanation and clarity, particularly from Alice Bailey, where she helps us to see a tremendous lot more into the meaning of the rays, for example. There are all sorts of exceptions to this. Now, HPB's Clearing Mind by Sister Key, it's really important to realise that Blavatsky was human. Sometimes you begin to wonder, don't you, whether people are so overwhelmed by the strength of her personality and her teachings that she was somehow semi-divine in the colloquial sense, not in the sense that we all have the spark of the divine. And that's why I've written Isis the Key, because the point arose during the week about Isis and about the fact that Blavatsky doesn't appear to believe in reincarnation in Isis Unveiled. And I think it's very important to realise that HPB had to clear her mind of the whole clinging teachings of spiritualism and all that it implied in order to get herself established into what the masters were really trying to get over through her. And I relate very strongly to that because I came from a deeply embedded Christian faith into Theosophy. I came with a deep knowledge of the Bible, with a huge knowledge of Christian theology. I've spent my spare time teaching Bible classes for years. I gave up teaching kids at the age of 40 and went over to adult classes, teaching adult classes and senior study groups and things. And somehow I had to clear my mind of all the rubbish that was generated when I tried to establish theosophical teaching in my mind. When Cornelia and I moved house just over a year ago, we had to do all sorts of alterations, changing all the ceilings to start with. And the rubbish we cleared out of that house in the course of renovating it was colossal. And I had to clear all this rubbish out of my mind and clarify it. It took me at least 5 years to do it. So don't be surprised that HPB had a clearing of the mind process going on. And it's not a good thing to forget how close to the end of her life she wrote the Key to Theosophy. If there were 3 books that I had to take to a desert island, one would be the Key to Theosophy, the second would be volume 3, and the third one would be this book, which is pure magic. The greatness of Geoffrey is there. Anyway, the Key to Theosophy has the whole business of the principles and what they mean clearly laid out. There is no ambiguity there at all. Now, again, we're into words and definitions, because if you define principles in one way, you can make it 5. If you define principle in another way, you can make it 7. In the way in which the word principle is normally used in Blavatsky Theosophy, there are 7, quite clearly. And in that 7, there is a gradation. Now, again, it's not the same gradation as you get in the correspondences in volume 3. Because the correspondences in volume 3 are very complex, as we saw this morning when someone asked about the colours. And we got into esoteric and exoteric colours in the correspondences. It's a minefield of complexity, and you can't go into it lightly. So how are the principles graded in Blavatsky Theosophy? Well, they're graded according to what I would like to call density. Not even graded according to frequency. Eddie put up, I think it was Eddie, put up a beautiful diagram, the best one I've ever seen, of the electromagnetic spectrum, and showed you how there's just this very narrow band of frequencies that cover the whole 7 colours of the optical spectrum. And it's only a tiny part of the huge frequency range of the electromagnetic spectrum. So they're not really graded according to frequency, because if they were, they'd all be squashed up in this little narrow band of colour. So how are they graded? Well, I would like to coin a phrase and say that they're graded according to occult density. Occult density, for want of a better word. Because if you recall, I think this also occurred during the week, we got onto the subject of matter. Now, in the secret doctrine, the word matter doesn't mean just physical matter. It means matter up through all the 7 planes. And so we're talking about the density of matter in that esoteric sense of matter, not just matter on the physical plane. So I think that density is a very good word. And if you grade the principles according to density in that way, you get the order in which Blavatsky puts them. Now, the next thing that causes endless confusion is the separation of the principles. And people say, well, how do you know that they're separate principles? Surely one blends into another. In his book, Geoffrey tackles the point. He says it's not like a chocolate layer cake with layers of cream and jam and a sprinkling of chocolate and nuts on the top and a sponge base. And you tend to give that impression when you unfortunately have to draw it as a table on the board. Neither is it a mixture. I wish I'd turned this on. Neither is it a mixture, but neither is it a fruit salad. You might say, well, it's not a chocolate layer cake, but maybe it's a fruit salad. Because you've got all these different fruits mixed together, the pineapple and the apple and the orange and the grape, and they're all mixed up together. And it's not like that either. Then you use this wonderful word, interpenetrate. The planes and principles interpenetrate each other. What the heck does that mean? Does anybody know what that means? I don't know what it means. I mean, if they're somehow into each other in such a way that they're so interblended that they're inseparable, you know, it's like after the cake mixtures had all the different ingredients put together and being stirred up.
With all the other colours.
So I think that there are some wonderful examples in the electrical engineering to do with permittivity and permeability, but I'd have to explain what they were, and so I can't use that example. But there is an example which I think helps a little bit, and that is, you know, when you're sitting in the car and you're trying to tune your radio stations, and you get one station and then you move the knob along a little way and there's nothing, and then there's another station. And you move the knob along a bit further and you find another station and there's nothing in between. There's nothing in between in a sort of esoteric sense. There's only nothing in between because there's nothing being transmitted there. And so this business of Antiparana and the Laya centres, Laya, are perhaps somehow understood in the context of the space between the programs in your car radio. They're also thought of as 0 points, so you can draw a sine wave, and of course, although it's full of energy and movement, goes through 0 points. So there's another way of looking at this business of the separation of the principles. It's tremendously important to realise that it's not just a game, an intellectual game we're playing here, that this is a reflection of a fundamental reality of the whole of cosmos, that it contains these 7 principles and these 7 planes. Now, validation of the sevenfold system. In science, validation is often accomplished. When I say validation, I mean convincing your peers that you're right. On interesting grounds. I've written down 3 words here: symmetry, simplicity, and hierarchy. And there is a particularly good example of how this business of simplicity and symmetry demonstrates itself in science. I can still remember the day when I was a schoolboy, when I was introduced to the periodic table of elements. I don't know whether any of you still remember it, but it has an elegance about it. It has a simplicity, and it has a symmetry, all of which have a ring of truth about them. It has a hierarchy as well. It has all 3 things, has the periodic table of elements: symmetry, simplicity, and hierarchy. incredibly simple, but incredibly convincing as an explanation of the way in which matter on the physical plane exists. Nearly 100 elements, well over 100 if you make the artificially made ones by man in his playing around with nuclear physics. So how does that fit with this business of the validation of the sevenfold system? Well, because when something is sevenfold and it correlates with other things that are related to it, which are also sevenfold, and the correlation seems to make sense, that is a form of validation that you're onto the truth. I could expand on it, but I've got a lot more to say this afternoon. Maybe you want to discuss it in question time, if we can get some at the end. Then, with this question of the principles and their unfoldment and latency. Now, Howard referred this morning to this business of Blavatsky going into Hyde Park and seeing all the soulless people. Now, when she said they were soulless, see, I don't think that she really meant that they'd actually totally lost their higher principles. They were latent. And this question of latency is tremendously important. Latent means there but not manifest in any shape or form. And so we say that ice has got latent heat in it. Or you have to put latent heat in to melt the ice, because the ice needs all this heat put into it to turn it into water, but it doesn't change temperature while it's changing from ice to water, because it requires this what we call latent heat, this hidden heat, this heat that doesn't manifest except in the outward form of the melting of the ice into water. And this latency occurs in ourselves, in the way in which we unfold or fail to unfold our potentials within our different principles. And when if we've got a certain combination of ray influences in us, then the way in which we react or don't react to those particular influences in us is also a question of unfoldment and latency. And it's tremendously important to realize this, that a lot of people who live their lives in the form in which Blavatsky saw them in Hyde Park, without developing any of their spiritual potential and leaving it all latent, have achieved nothing in this life. And they're like the Buddhist idea of your lives being beads on a necklace. And the life produces no bead to put on the necklace, to put it in pictorial language. It becomes a wasted life, a life that you might as well not have bothered to live. In fact, it might have been a good thing if you hadn't lived it at all, because you might end up with a lot more negative karma than you started. So that there are all sorts of risks there. Now, one thing that is I think self-evident. I don't suppose there's anybody here this afternoon who's going to argue about the fact that the mind is the seat of consciousness. Without your mind, you can't be conscious. And the importance of that, I hope, will emerge in due time. But like everything else, both mind and consciousness are sevenfold. And first of all, in Deity, Cosmos and Man, Geoffrey brings out the 7 states of consciousness as derived from volume 3. Well, let me just make a point here that if you read DCNM, he never refers either to Collected Writings 12 or to volume 3. He refers to the addendum to the Secret Doctrine. Now, the numbering in Deity, Cosmos and Man, the page numbering, is for volume 12 of the Collected Writings and not the page numbering for volume 3. So why is there different page numbering? Well, the story goes that when Annie Besant took hold of Blavatsky's papers after Blavatsky had died, and she saw all this material which she thought Blavatsky had intended to put into volume 3 of The Secret Doctrine, and she assembled it all. But she fiddled with it. She modified it here and there in different ways, to different degrees. And when asked, so the story goes, when asked why she did it, she said she thought it made it more easier to understand or more self-explicit, or whatever the words was she used. She had an excuse for doing it. But when Boris de Zirkov came along, much later, and put all of Blavatsky's writings together into what we now call the collected writings, some 14 volumes of them, he took all the material that Annie Besant had and put into volume 3, and put it into volume 12 unchanged. So if you get volume 12, you get the pure Blavatsky original writings. If you take volume 3, you get the Annie Besant variant on the same material. So that's why the page numbering is different. Anyway, let's just look at these 7 states of consciousness to start off with. These are the states which Geoffrey puts in his Deity, Cosmos and Man. And they take some looking at, don't they? Because they are really quite strange. And in fact, when Bessie put them into volume 3, she fiddled about with them quite a bit. But she did do one or two interesting things. She saw that the psychic consciousness was really associated with self-consciousness. You know, the word self isn't on this page, but it really should be in a way, because we have this dual consciousness. This is probably the most fantastic thing we have about us, and there are all sorts of fantastic things about our human body and its consciousness. But probably one of the most fantastic thing of all is that we have a dual consciousness, a consciousness and a self-consciousness. And the self, she puts in at this level, and will, she puts in at this level, because we've not only got a self-consciousness, but we have something which we call will, which is entirely different from ordinary thinking processes. It's another level of command in ourselves, which, if we're lucky, we take control of and use to run our lives. But if it controls us, and we're not in charge of our thinking and decision-making process, our lives can go all astray. And so we come now to some of the key statements in volume 3 of the collected writings, volume 12 of the collected writings, where we read, there are 2 poles in everything, 7 states in every state. 7 states in every state, and it's only the tip of the iceberg, because it again and again, and finally ending up with a very complicated diagram, which I've not reproduced fully here, we get the whole business of the subplanes, which is what the talk is really all about. So we're just getting into the talk proper now, really, if you like. Because here you can see the 7 principles graded in the way that I have just described according to occult density, for want of a better word, here in the order in which Blavatsky puts them in not only the Secret Doctrine, but in her very last technical book in the Key to Theosophy. In the Key to Theosophy, she lays it out absolutely crystal clear that these are the 7 principles in that order, and that they're divided by the Antipurana, which I'll go into in a minute, into 2 entirely separate units of the individual and the personality. The individuality is something which goes on from life to life, and the personality is all to do with the physical life that we're living now. And this is also crystal clear in the Key to Theosophy that no one can claim any degree of ambiguity about it at all. And so we have the 7 within the 7. And so here And I'll go into all the implications of this in a minute, so don't try and jump too far ahead of me as you think about this. There are 7 sub-principles within each of the 7 principles. And if that wasn't bad enough, there's another reference which suggests that there are 7 within the 7 within the 7 ad nauseam, so that you have a subtlety of complexity which defies the mind to think about. But you've just got 49 sub-principles, 7 times 49 sub-principles, 49 squared, whatever that is, sub-principles and so on. Now you say, well, what is this all about? Well, let's start off by thinking about the correspondences which Howard mentioned this morning of colour and sound. First of all, let's look at colour, because it gives us a good insight into what all this means. If you go out into the beech woods at this time of the year, when the beech trees are changing colour, you're presented with one of nature's great glories of colour, because you see not only the dark browns of the early fading leaves, but you see the bright colours of orange and yellow, right fading down into green. There's a few leaves that haven't yet caught the message that autumn is coming. And how are all these wonderful colours in the beechwoods generated? Because the colours, if you like, have got sub-principles, because the colours are mixed together in all sorts of combinations. Now, they're not mixed together in equal quantities. Now, this is a terribly important point, easily missed, that they're not mixed together in equal quantities. To generate the incredible colours in nature, you mix this primary 7 colours together in different proportions. Some are latent, they're left altogether out of the picture. Others are mixed together in all sorts of complicated ways to produce all the wonderful colours in nature. And if you wander through John Lewis's or Selfridge's in Oxford Street and look at all the different colours in the dresses and the curtain materials and so on, you see again this same principle, a magnificent array of different colours generated out of the primary 7. So that there is a very good insight into why we are all so different from each other. And we are incredibly different from each other. I mean, not just in our facial expression, because if you went through the whole world and managed to find someone else who looked exactly like you, which is very improbable in spite of the umpteen billion people that live on the planet, even if you found somebody that looked like you, it's incredibly unlikely they'd have the same personality as you. So you get some degree, some measure of the complexity that is built into this picture of the 7-fold nature of the 7 principles in man. Now, the next thing that's important to understand, and this is how we work, is that the mind directs consciousness. We have this incredible facility within ourselves to turn the focus of our mind through these principles and sub-principles. And you get an example of it. You wake up in the middle of the night having had a nightmare, and you deliberately want to turn your mind out of that nightmare into something nice, and you go through the usual techniques of thinking about last summer holiday or some nice meal you've been out to with your friends. You try and move your mind, the focus of your mind, out of the nightmare into something else, and you deliberately transfer it. And I think here in one of my references, referring to it, it says, talking about David Child and Carmeloka, because all of this is terribly important to the after-death states, and I've got references here about that as well if I have time to get round to them. It says, Devachan is a state on a plane of spiritual consciousness. Karmaloka is a place of physical consciousness. It is the shadow of the animal world and that of instinctual feelings. When the consciousness thinks of spiritual things, it is on a spiritual plane. When you think of sex, you're on the karmic plane. When you think of food, you're probably on the physical plane. All the different aspects of our nature are brought into, if you like to go back to my previous point, into unfoldment by the way in which we choose to direct the focus of our consciousness. And we all did it. If we don't do it very much these days, or if we do it, we do it without realizing it. When we were students, we deliberately had to force our minds to think about the thing we were studying about and to chop out all the ancillary distractions of people talking in the next room and the television set and the rumblings of your stomach. You have to actually cut out everything else to actually think about what you were trying to study. You were moving the focus of your consciousness. And so the mind directs consciousness into these things which the secret doctrine calls the 49 fires in one place, because they are so powerful and so important. And the same thing is true of sound. I had wondered whether I'd get Harold to play me some major and minor chords on the piano to illustrate this point, but I decided it was too much of a distraction. But the whole business of sound is the same. You pick up certain notes in the sevenfold scale and strike these beautiful chords of sound, because certain parts are brought out into focus, into unfoldment, while the rest lie latent and unstruck notes of the piano. So let's move on to the significance of all this. One of the significances of this sevenfold system within seven is the mind. You see, the mind is number 5. So up here, in all the other principles, you have 5 with its little dots across it. Now, why has it got little dots across it? Because the antikarana goes through mind wherever mind occurs. So you've got this antikarana division wherever mind occurs in the whole of the 7 principles. And the significance of that is huge. And hopefully I can go into it in more detail in just a moment. Because the mind links with memory. If a person loses their memory, they lose all awareness of who they are. It's a terrifying thing to see someone who's lost their memory. They don't know who they are, they don't know who their relatives are, they don't even know who they love and who they hate. They don't know what sort of food they like to eat. They don't know where they live. It's a terrifying thing. So mind and memory are very, very closely linked together. So this 5 here, to do with mind, appears down here in this astral plane, because a lot of the memory is in the astral plane. Now, the memory takes on 2 different parts. The memory is divided into 2 in the same way that our consciousness is divided into 2, into self-consciousness and consciousness. Here, the mind is divided into 2 because the memory is twofold. The memory is associated with the physical brain, below the antikarana here, and above it, associated with the astral light and the ongoing memory of the life we've lived. And so you get, going back to the after-death states again, which those of you who've heard this lecture before was a major part of the lecture, it's not this afternoon, you will see there how the way in which the person who's dying, whose physical brain is now largely inoperative because it's just decayed and perhaps it's starved of oxygen due to some illness, but the memory is still there. How is the memory still there? Because as part of the mind principle above this antikarana here in the sub-principle, and it enables the mind to contact the astral light and experience the memory as it as the person dies and shifts into the karma loka in the first stage of the death process. So that illustrates that. And what about the etheric body, which David spent so much huge research on, and which has been a recurring theme to some degree during European school? Well, let's just look at how the etheric body appears when you look at it in this sub-principle system. Because, in effect, you've got the astral, number 2, represented in the physical. In the physical body, you can experience the astral. And if you listen to Eric, who was doing the previous lecture, he can tell you about some of his experiences, that while he's still living in a physical body, he can have astral travel and astral experiences, because he can only do it because the astral is represented in the physical as a sub-principle. Otherwise he couldn't do it. And similarly, it's the other way around, because if you're in the astral, you can be represented in the physical. This number 1 here explains why the astral beings can somehow show themselves in the physical form. The only reason that they can show themselves in physical form is because the physical is a sub-principle in the astral. And I think that the whole discussion about the etheric body is really solved if you think hard enough about the way in which the astral and the physical interact with each other on the sub-principle level. You have to think about it. I can't do all the thinking about it for you in the middle of a talk, but I suggest to you that if you really think about the implications of this teaching, they are huge, absolutely huge, and all sorts of other interreactions. Now, you would expect me to say this, and so I don't really need to apologise for saying it, but I think Annie Besant was actually wrong about these 2 upper extra principles that she put on. I don't think you can explain it away totally by talking about the tattvas either. I think that she mistook sub-principles for principles. That's the way I see it. I mean, it's my own personal opinion, but I'm just offering it to you. You don't have to accept it. But I do think that she thought that this the 7th sub-principle here, the Atmic sub-principle of Atma, was her top principle, and her Buddhic sub-principle of Atma was her second one. I think that the 2 extra principles that she put on top of Atma were actually a mistake on her part. She was mistaking them for the sub-principles that lie within the Atmic principle. And so, for me, this is the magic chart which really solves all the problems. Now, you can see why I'm attracted to it, can't you? Because you've not only got hierarchy, the 7s coming from out here somewhere, the umpteenth sub-principle, right the way through to the sub-principle and the main principle. You've not only got that hierarchy there, but you've got a wonderful symmetry, and really you've got simplicity. You've got the 3 things which are looked upon with such great favour in ordinary science, here in esoteric science. Simplicity, symmetry, and hierarchy. And I'm only giving you one example in the periodic table, but I have to give you another example out of my own experience, because twice during my research career, I had a huge problem of trying to relate complicated experimental data into an understandable and meaningful, coherent form. And you couldn't imagine anything, could you? If that's your y-axis and that's your x-axis, you couldn't imagine anything simpler, could you, than a straight line with dots all around it. And I was presented twice in the same career with experimental data that was all over the place, dotted all over the page. And by playing around with really fairly complex mathematics with the data, I had a function of x here, although it was very, very complicated, which gave rise to related to a function of y here, which was also fairly complicated, which put all the dots on one straight line. Amazing. They were all over the page. And by getting the mathematics right here and here, I got them onto one straight line. I did it twice in one scientific career. And it has exactly the same quality about it. It has simplicity. What could be simpler than the dots on a straight line? It had symmetry. And it has an amazing hierarchy to it, because it ran all the way through from very low values of function x to very high values of function x. And it enabled you to predict all sorts of things. From that one straight line, you could then go backwards and feed in different states and get the answer out. And it was quite fantastic. So you see why I'm rather wedded to this idea of symmetry, simplicity, and hierarchy. Anyway, I've taken my time. I'm surprised my thing hasn't clicked, as it's about to do. I've had my 45 minutes, so I'm going to stop, and I may have raised a whole lot of questions and comments in your minds, and I hope at least I've given you food for thought. So over to you. Yes?
Could you tell me what you think the implications are of the Antakarana being present in each layer?
Yes, because the Antakarana is the difference between physical consciousness and spiritual consciousness. It's the difference between self-consciousness and ordinary consciousness. The Antakarana's significance is absolutely tremendous. And I mean, the most important part, of course, is to do with the after-death states, because everything that we have in ourselves below the Antakarana dies with our physical body, and eventually, and all we're left with is our individuality. So this is the great argument, that if you don't develop, if you leave all your principles above the Antakarana latent throughout the whole of your lives, you've got nothing when you die. Because you lose everything below the Antakarana when you die. If you haven't actually developed the faculty of taking your consciousness out of its latency in these higher principles, you've got nothing when you die. Nothing at all. And that was why Blavatsky was so appalled when she came back from Hyde Park, which she saw so many people there who hadn't actually generated anything in terms of consciousness above the Antakarana. Yes.
This is one point of view. Of course, Blavatsky mentions that there were actually soulless people.
Yeah.
There were people that because of the excess of materialism, they would lose completely the link with the higher principles, and they could even reincarnate with the lower principles until these principles with the time dissolve and die. But the higher principles would be completely disconnected from the person, so the person would be soulless.
You see, that is exactly the point. That is exactly the point. People may reincarnate again and again and again, and the futility of it is just appalling, just absolutely futile, going on life after life without ever bringing any of these out of latency into unfoldment. And but you see, you can't. I mean, I'm sure if HBB was here, she would support me on this. She's not saying that somehow you can wipe out the sevenfold nature of matter. It's effectively gone because it's totally latent. But it is there in potential. It's potentially there. You know, when you switch off the electric light, the electricity is there in the poles of the switch. It's still there, but it's not manifest in any shape or form unless you take the cover off, put your finger on it, you know it's there. But I mean, the light isn't on. You see, we have to draw a very careful distinction between the way in which we interpret it. You know, there's a great saying amongst Bible scholars that when you interpret any particular statement in the Bible, you should only do it in such a way that it doesn't make nonsense of any other statement in the Bible. So you're not really entitled to be a Bible scholar or Bible teacher unless you know the Bible pretty well, because you've got to be sure you don't make this fundamental error of putting your own interpretation upon a particular text in the Bible and then find out there are half a dozen texts scattered throughout the other pages of the Bible which make a nonsense of what you said. So, and the same thing is absolutely true here, and it's true in every other branch of knowledge. You must be able to demonstrate consistency of interpretation. You don't develop consistency of interpretation, you just leave yourself wide open to be shot down in the first argument you get into. Yes, Ben.
Right. As you can imagine, I have all sorts of problems with this. Is the word etheric, in your mind, Colin, is the word etheric, does the word etheric cover sub-principles 5, 6 and 7 of physical, or does the etheric cover the whole lot, the first 21 sub-principles up to the top of the ground?
Well, it's a very good question. I think I don't need notice of that question. But what I want to say to you, absolutely for certain, what I want to say to you before I even make an attempt to answer it, David, is that I do not think the two words are synonymous. I don't think that astral and etheric are synonymous, that you can interchange those words at random in the teachings or in the literature or anywhere else. There's something well, I mean, Linga Sharira is just the Sanskrit words for astral body. I mean, Sharira is just body. I mean, using the different terminology, you know, prana you could put down life force, as Geoffrey does in his book, or you can put down chi, for example. There are all sorts of words that mean the same thing as prana. I mean, this is one of the great difficulties when you first come to Theosophy, that Theosophy uses half a dozen different words and means the same thing. It makes life terribly confusing for the student, because until you realise that it's the same thing, but just a different word being used to describe it, you're left in dead trouble. I mean, this is called karma manas a lot, because the emotional principle is very closely linked with the brain, the physical brain. It's called karma manas. But Geoffrey, you'll see in the book, uses the word emotion, the emotional principle, because it is basically the emotional principle. And the sub-principles, particularly noticeable here, because the physical body is so violently affected by emotion. If you get angry, all sorts of chemicals are actually injected by glands in your body into your bloodstream. Or if you're ecstatically happy, other chemicals are injected into your bloodstream. Actual physiological changes take place in your body due to the emotion that you have. So this sub-physical sub-principle here is very, very important when it comes to the emotional development or activity in the human body, in the human structure. So, but to go back to David's point about the etheric and how far it operates through these sub-principles, I don't think I would David, I don't think I would actually want to put a range, sort of spanning of my fingers across a certain range of sub-principles in order to answer your question. What I would much rather do would be to draw links between the physical, like sort of here, taking 2 down to 1 and 2 up to 1, and drawing links like that in to show how there's the interaction. You know, and I put down my own way of describing this in my notes is to put down, say, atma for the top principle there, atma, where the first use of the word refers to the principle and the second use of the word refers to the sub-principle. But really and truly, you have to sit down and think very carefully about how this works. I don't really want to do more than point the way to you. If you really are interested in how this works, you need to sit down quietly when there's no distractions and think it through, because I think it's incredibly important. Anybody else? Yes.
Just a question, an interrogation point I will leave. Have you ever thought that this lower quaternary, in the way that Blavatsky presents, it might be not the proper way, and she did it in purpose, because she is presenting an esoteric system that we must unveil the keys by ourselves. Just an interrogation point. There is also this possibility.
Yeah, there is.
And she also mentions it.
Yeah, this is the great trap.
Yeah.
This is the great elephant trap that you can fall into so easily, because she doesn't always tell you where she's put the blinds in her literature, and you only discover them by falling into the hole and trying to claw your way out of it again. And that was why I was so keen in my talk, Erica, to talk about the whole business of validation, of establishing some parameters that you look for, which give you a clue that she's actually on main beam and not trying to distract you down into the wings of the theatre. You see, the whole business of symmetry, simplicity, and hierarchy are parameters that you look for when you're looking for the truth. Anybody else? David again, yes.
How do you reconcile Atma and Prana? Prana being a reflection or a manifestation of Atma, as been said 2 or 3 times this week.
Yeah.
So how do you cope with that in this particular classification?
Well,
you've
you've got the sub-principle of Atma here, and you've got the sub-principle of Prana here. So all you're really saying is, if you like, take the example of a huge telephone exchange, that you can actually make all these different connections between different subscribers who've got telephones that are linked into this exchange, and you can make all these different interconnections because of the existence of the sub-principles within each principle. If the sub-principles weren't there, you couldn't make the connection and there wouldn't be the interaction. But as long as you accept that this teaching, which I think is in Esoteric Instruction 3 in the sequence. I mean, I remember years ago we had a European school in Sweden, Boston was it? And I remember Geoffrey came out with this for the first time. He produced this chart. I know I think I have actually got the chart here somewhere, a photocopy of it from the book. Well, I'd like to show it to you. No, I haven't. But he produced this chart. I had never ever heard of the sub-principles before, and suddenly he brought this chart out and started talking about it. And it wasn't until after he died, when I was still worrying about the etheric body, and thinking to myself, there must be, as I told you, he spent 2 years struggling with an attempt to find a link which related the different systems of theosophical teaching. And unfortunately, I never thought of it until after he died. I was so cross with myself that I hadn't thought of it before that, and asked him what he thought about it. So it comes, this teaching, I'm afraid my interpretation of this teaching comes to you without Geoffrey's blessing. Or perhaps it has got his blessing, I don't know.
Colin, just to elaborate on David, in this unpublished material by HPB, she says actually prana is dual. So there is a higher aspect of prana and the lower. And of course, in the Upanishads, prana and atma were synonymous initially. The
Yeah.
higher principle was called prana, but not the physical vital energy, but the abstract life.
Yes, but you see, that is exactly what I'm trying to say, Michael.